Silent detachment, the power of withholding justification. The urge to explain is usually fear disguised as clarity. It shows up quietly, almost politely. Someone misunderstands you, and your first instinct is to clarify. Someone questions your decision, and you rush to justify it. Someone reacts negatively, and you begin outlining your intentions. These moments feel reasonable on the surface, but beneath them sits a deeper emotional need. The need to be understood. Most people never examine this impulse. They believe explaining themselves makes them stronger, more transparent, more reasonable. But psychologically, constant explanation does something very different. It reveals uncertainty. It exposes attachment. It signals that your inner stability depends on how others interpret you. Over-explaining quietly communicates insecurity, not because your reasons are wrong, but because your need to present them is visible. This creates emotional tension. You feel misunderstood, so you speak more. You feel judged, so you defend. You feel unseen, so you try harder to be clear. And each time you do this, you place your emotional balance into someone else's hands. That is where power begins to leak. What most people miss is that justification gives others control over your narrative. The moment you start explaining, you enter their frame. You accept their assumptions. You position yourself as someone who must prove clarity. You invite evaluation. You stop standing in your own authority. Strong minds understand something subtle. Not everything requires explanation. Silence is not weakness. Silence is composure. When you resist the urge to justify, you create psychological distance. That distance forces others to adjust. They start paying attention. They begin observing instead of questioning. They become curious instead of critical. Silence creates gravity. Human psychology responds to what feels contained. When you stop filling every gap with words, others fill it with interpretation. They assign meaning to your restraint. They perceive confidence where there is calm. They feel authority where there is control. This is not manipulation. This is perception. Most people try to manage how they are seen by talking more. But presence is shaped more by what you withhold than what you reveal. When you constantly explain yourself, you remove mystery. You remove tension. You remove the space where respect forms. Emotional tension insight comes here. Needing to be understood weakens presence. When your peace depends on someone else recognizing your intention, you become reactive. You begin shaping your behavior around their opinions. You explain choices. You justify boundaries. You soften decisions. You start living in response mode. Silent detachment pulls you out of that loop. You stop explaining why you said no. You stop defending your direction. You stop clarifying things that don't require clarification. You let your actions exist without commentary. At first this feels uncomfortable. Silence feels like abandonment. You worry about being misunderstood. You feel the urge to fix perceptions. But if you stay inside that discomfort long enough, something changes. You realize you don't need to manage everyone's interpretation. You realize that your worth does not depend on being correctly perceived. You realize that calm restraint communicates more than explanation ever could. This creates a mindset shift. Instead of chasing clarity through words, you create clarity through behavior. Instead of justifying decisions, you stand by them. Instead of correcting every misunderstanding, you let time reveal truth. Instead of needing agreement, you accept difference. This is internal authority forming. You stop positioning yourself as someone who must be approved. You become someone who simply exists in alignment. People feel this. They sense when you are no longer emotionally accessible on demand. They notice when you don't rush to respond. They feel when your energy is contained. Conversations change, dynamics shift. Your presence becomes heavier, not aggressive, grounded. Your silence begins to carry meaning. You no longer argue your value, you embody it. You don't convince people, you allow them to observe. This is emotional independence. You stop explaining yourself to be liked. You stop clarifying to feel safe. You stop justifying to feel accepted. You become comfortable letting others sit with uncertainty. That comfort is rare. Most people cannot tolerate being misunderstood. They rush to fix it. But strong minds understand that being misunderstood temporarily is better than being emotionally exposed constantly. You learn to let things be. You allow assumptions to exist. You let people reveal their own projections. This teaches you something powerful. Those who truly matter will understand without explanation. Those who don't were never looking to understand in the first place. Silent detachment also protects your energy. Every explanation costs something emotionally. Every justification drains focus. When you stop over-communicating, you conserve mental space. You move cleaner. You think clearer. You react less. You become more selective with words. You speak only when it adds value. You remain quiet when silence holds strength. This reshapes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs to clarify. You become someone who trusts their own alignment. You stop seeking approval. You stop negotiating dignity. You stop leaking power through explanation. You become someone who stands without commentary. Someone who doesn't rush to be understood. Someone who doesn't explain themselves into smaller versions of who they are. You learn that withholding justification is not arrogance. It is self-respect. And once you understand that, your presence changes permanently, because power doesn't arrive when people finally understand you. It arrives when you no longer require their understanding. Perception shift. Why silence rewrites power dynamics. People respect what doesn't chase validation. This is one of the quiet laws of human behavior. When someone feels emotionally complete within themselves, others sense it immediately. They may not be able to explain why, but they feel it in the way that person moves, speaks less, and reacts slower. Silence, when it comes from control rather than avoidance, changes the entire dynamic of an interaction. Most people believe influence comes from explanation. They think clarity builds respect. They think talking things through makes them appear reasonable. But psychologically, constant clarification does the opposite. It signals that you need acceptance. It reveals attachment to how you're perceived. Silence removes that signal. What most people miss is how silence forces others to project meaning. When you don't explain, the mind fills the gap. Human beings are uncomfortable with ambiguity. When you leave space, people instinctively try to interpret it. They start observing your behavior more closely. They replay conversations. They analyze tone. They search for cues. This creates psychological gravity. Instead of you chasing understanding, others move toward you mentally. This is the unseen social pattern. When you stop defending your choices, people begin measuring them. When you stop justifying your silence, others start wondering about it. When you stop explaining your boundaries, they feel them. Silence shifts the frame. You are no longer the one seeking agreement. They become the ones seeking clarity. Human behavior changes in response to this. People treat what feels emotionally scarce as valuable. When your reactions become rare, they carry more weight. When your words become selective, they gain impact. When your presence feels self-contained, it commands attention. This is the psychological leverage point. Withholding explanation creates emotional gravity, not by force, by restraint. You are no longer broadcasting availability. You are no longer offering emotional access on demand. You become someone whose internal state is not immediately visible. That mystery increases perceived power. This does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming deliberate. You still care, you still feel, but you stop performing those feelings publicly. You stop narrating your inner world. You stop explaining your intentions. You allow others to meet you where you stand. This creates a mindset shift. Instead of managing perception, you allow perception to form naturally. You stop trying to be understood by everyone. You focus on being aligned with yourself. This changes how conversations unfold. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't over-clarify statements. You don't justify decisions that are already made. You let your calm exist without commentary. People respond differently. They become more careful with their words. They pause longer before speaking. They sense that you are not easily swayed. Your composure makes them reflect. This is how presence becomes influence. When you stop explaining, you also stop feeding emotional loops. You don't escalate misunderstandings. You don't engage in circular arguments. You don't chase closure from people who are not capable of providing it. You conserve energy. You preserve dignity. You maintain internal authority. This also exposes something important. Not everyone deserves access to your reasoning. Some people seek explanations only to challenge them. Some look for clarity only to find leverage. When you stop offering justifications freely, you reveal who respects boundaries and who only respects access. Silence becomes a filter. Those who are emotionally mature adapt. Those who are emotionally dependent push harder. This teaches you where to invest attention. You become less reactive to opinions. You stop trying to win narratives. You let behavior speak. Over time, this reshapes your identity. You no longer feel obligated to clarify yourself. You no longer feel responsible for how others interpret your silence. You become comfortable letting people misunderstand temporarily. That comfort signals confidence. People feel when you don't need their approval. They sense when you are not emotionally available to be pulled into every exchange. They recognize that your reactions are intentional, and because of that, your presence gains authority. You become someone whose silence carries meaning. Someone whose words are chosen. Someone whose emotional boundaries are felt without being announced. You don't explain your standards. You live them. This changes power dynamics subtly but permanently. You are no longer negotiating respect. You are embodying it. You are no longer participating in emotional tug of war. You remain grounded while others reveal their intentions through behavior. Silence also sharpens perception. Without emotional noise, you see more clearly. You observe tone shifts. You notice inconsistencies. You read body language. You sense energy changes in rooms. Emotional detachment enhances awareness. You become harder to manipulate, harder to provoke, harder to influence emotionally, because your center doesn't move easily. This is when identity consolidates. You stop explaining. You stop defending. You stop chasing understanding. You become someone whose presence commands attention without demand. Someone who doesn't need to prove. Someone who lets silence do the work. And when that happens, power stops being something you pursue. It becomes something others feel when they interact with you. Internal regulations. Mastering the need to be right. Every misunderstanding creates an internal conflict. A part of you wants to correct it. Another part wants to defend. Another wants to be seen accurately. This tension happens in seconds, often before you're consciously aware of it. Most people immediately act on that impulse. They explain, they clarify, they argue their perspective. They try to restore balance by proving they are right. That reflex feels natural, but it is also the doorway where emotional control is lost. The need to be right is rarely about truth. It is about identity. When someone questions your actions, your values, or your intentions, the nervous system interprets it as threat. Your body tightens, your thoughts speed up, your emotions rise, and without awareness you respond from that state. This is where discipline changes everything. Emotional control does not start with what you say. It starts with what you tolerate inside yourself. It begins the moment discomfort appears and you decide not to move with it. Instead of reacting, you stay present. Instead of correcting, you pause. Instead of defending, you breathe. Most people never practice this. They confuse emotional expression with authenticity. They believe speaking immediately proves honesty, but real emotional control comes from allowing sensation without turning it into behavior. You feel misunderstood. You notice the urge to explain. You do nothing. That pause is power. In that pause, you separate impulse from action. You create a mental boundary. You tell your nervous system that discomfort does not require response. Over time, this rewires how you experience emotional pressure. The trigger still arrives, but it no longer commands you. This is internal regulation. You stop being led by emotional momentum. You stop needing to resolve everything instantly. You stop chasing validation through clarification. You learn to sit with uncertainty without collapsing into explanation. This changes how people experience you. You become harder to provoke, harder to bait into arguments, harder to emotionally corner, because you no longer give immediate reactions. You allow silence. You allow space. You allow others to reveal themselves. That space becomes a mirror. People begin filling it with their own assumptions, projections, and insecurities. They speak more. They justify themselves. They over-explain. Meanwhile, you remain steady. This is psychological transformation. You move from reactive to intentional, from emotionally driven to internally governed. You stop trying to control how others see you. You focus on controlling how you respond. This shift gives you clarity. Without emotional urgency clouding your thinking, you see patterns. You notice who respects boundaries. You observe who only engages when emotions are available. You recognize when conversations are about power rather than understanding. This awareness sharpens your decisions. You choose when to speak. You choose when silence communicates more. You choose when engagement adds value. You choose when withdrawal protects your energy. Most people feel uncomfortable with silence. They rush to fill it. They mistake stillness for weakness. But internal discipline teaches you that silence is a position. It communicates that you are not emotionally dependent on outcomes. That independence is felt. People sense when you don't need to win every exchange. They notice when you don't chase agreement. They feel when you are grounded regardless of their opinion. This changes power dynamics instantly. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer prove your perspective. You allow your actions to speak. And action speaks slower, but louder. Internal regulation also changes how you deal with disrespect. Instead of reacting emotionally, you observe it. You don't explain. You don't explain. You don't justify boundaries. You simply adjust access. You become selective with attention. You become deliberate with energy. You become emotionally self-contained. This is where identity begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone who needs to correct every misunderstanding. You become someone who lets behavior reveal truth. You stop needing closure from every interaction. You become comfortable leaving things unresolved. That comfort signals strength. You no longer require emotional resolution to feel stable. You no longer seek validation through response. You remain centered even when others are unsettled. This inner discipline also affects how you experience success and failure. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't collapse you. You receive both with the same composure. You understand that external reactions are temporary, but internal alignment is permanent. You stop tying your self-worth to perception. You stop tying your peace to agreement. You stop tying your identity to being right. Instead, you anchor yourself in awareness. That awareness becomes your shield. You become less predictable, less reactive, less emotionally accessible, and because of that, you become harder to influence. This is not about emotional suppression. You still feel deeply, but you feel privately. You process internally. You move intentionally. You don't outsource your emotional stability. You don't hand power to provocation. You don't let misunderstanding dictate behavior. You stay grounded. You stay observant. You stay composed. And over time, this discipline reshapes your entire presence. You become someone whose reactions are rare, whose words are measured, whose silence carries weight. You stop being controlled by the need to be right. You start being guided by clarity. You stop fighting every narrative. You allow time to expose truth. Quiet authority. When you let actions replace words, imagine reaching a point where you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. Not because you've become detached from people, but because you've become grounded within yourself. Your decisions don't require validation. Your silence doesn't feel awkward. Your presence doesn't depend on approval. This is what quiet authority looks like when emotional discipline matures into identity. Most people believe power comes from being heard. They think influence is built through argument, persuasion, or visible confidence. But there is another form of strength that operates beneath the surface. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't defend itself. It doesn't compete for attention. It simply exists. When you stop explaining yourself, something subtle happens inside you. You stop anticipating reactions. You stop preparing justifications. You stop rehearsing conversations in your mind. You become more present, more observant, more selective. Your energy becomes contained. Contained energy feels powerful. People sense it immediately. They may not understand why, but they feel that you are not easily moved. Your calm doesn't fluctuate with their mood. Your tone doesn't rise when tension appears. Your posture doesn't change when challenged. This steadiness becomes your authority, not authority over others. Authority over yourself. That internal command is what makes you difficult to manipulate. Emotional influence only works on people who react. Provocation only succeeds when someone takes the bait. Control only exists where there is emotional attachment. When you detach from the need to explain, those entry points disappear. You begin letting actions speak. You allow time to reveal truth. You stop correcting every misunderstanding. You stop chasing agreement. You stop trying to manage perception. Instead, you live in alignment. Your behavior becomes consistent. Your boundaries become felt. Your silence becomes intentional. This creates long-term power, not dramatic power, not loud power, stable power. People start treating you differently. Conversations become more respectful. Others become more careful with their words. They sense that you are not emotionally available for chaos. They realize that you do not engage in unnecessary exchanges. This shifts dynamics without confrontation. You don't need to dominate. You don't need to explain. Your composure enforces boundaries. You also become more comfortable with being misunderstood. You no longer rush to correct assumptions. You understand that clarity is not always immediate. You let people sit with their interpretations. Those who are emotionally mature adjust. Those who are emotionally dependent reveal themselves. This gives you insight. You stop wasting energy on those who demand explanations. You invest in those who respect silence. This is emotional independence. You no longer measure your worth by how well others understand you. You no longer seek reassurance through conversation. You no longer feel compelled to justify your choices. That trust creates presence. Presence creates influence. Influence creates authority. You begin walking differently. Slower. More grounded. You speak less, but with intention. You listen more, but selectively. You don't rush into emotional exchanges. People feel this. They sense that your reactions are not automatic. They realize that access to your emotional world is limited. That scarcity increases respect. You also notice something else without constant explanation. Your mind becomes quieter. You stop replaying conversations. You stop worrying about how you came across. You stop mentally defending your actions. This gives you clarity. Clarity improves decision making. Decision making strengthens confidence. Confidence stabilizes presence. You become someone who does not argue their value. You live it. This changes how you handle conflict. Instead of escalating emotionally, you disengage calmly. Instead of defending yourself verbally, you adjust boundaries. Instead of reacting, you observe. You let behavior inform your choices. You stop needing closure from every interaction. You stop seeking emotional resolution. You allow things to end without explanation. This level of detachment is not coldness. It is maturity. You understand that not every situation requires your energy. Not every misunderstanding needs your correction. Not every opinion deserves your attention. You become selective. Selection is power. Your silence becomes deliberate. Your words become rare. Your presence becomes heavier. And people feel it. They feel when you are not trying to convince. They feel when you are not seeking validation. They feel when you are internally stable. That stability is magnetic. You no longer explain yourself into smaller versions of who you are. You allow others to rise to your level of awareness. You stop chasing respect. You embody it. And at some point, you realize something quietly profound. Power didn't arrive when people finally understood you. It arrived when you stopped needing them to, and in doing so, you step into a quieter form of strength. One where emotional regulation becomes instinct, restraint becomes natural, and your internal stability becomes stronger than any external pressure.